You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim du Bois.
Every member of the U.S. House is up for election in Minnesota this November, and at least a couple of the races are tightening up. Now, more of our conversation with University of Minnesota political science professor Kathryn Pearson. Let's turn now to the U.S. Senate race. The incumbent Amy Klobuchar is being challenged by Republican Kurt Bills. Klobuchar has been a very popular candidate. We've even seen polling numbers that indicate some voters who are Republican will come to the polls, cast a ballot for Romney, and in turn vote for Klobuchar. So we see a lot of split ballots in that respect. How have the approval ratings of Congress, the very, very negative numbers that we've seen, have they had any impact whatsoever upon Klobuchar?
Well, what's so fascinating is that it does not seem that Congress's abysmal approval ratings, I mean, we've seen record lows, 10%, 12% of the electorate approving of Congress's performance. That really doesn't seem to have eroded Senator Klobuchar's support. But on the other hand, there's an old adage that individuals may hate the institution, but they love their own member of Congress. And that's been true for a long time. And it's because individual members of Congress are able to distinguish themselves from their colleagues by doing district or state-specific things, by helping people with casework, constituent support, getting out in the state and meeting people, and really getting to know voters. And then many members of Congress will just cast the rest of them as a bunch of crooks or a bunch of people who can't agree on anything.
Klobuchar's support, again, is very broad. We see support from Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Klobuchar's opponents like to throw her voting record out and say, if you look at the voting record of Senator Klobuchar, it is very, very close to the way Senator Franken votes, and they're painting him as an ultra-liberal. How is Senator Klobuchar able to deflect those kind of comments when the record does seem to indicate that's the case?
Right. Well, the record does show that she votes with her party most of the time, just as Senator Franken does, just as really just about every senator and every representative does. We are living in an era of partisan polarization, where more often than not, the parties take positions in opposition to one another, and the members of the two parties are voting against one another. So I think what Senator Klobuchar has done pretty effectively is show that a lot of the work leading up to those final votes has been bipartisan. Whether it's co-sponsoring legislation, work in committee, so doing the things that lead up to final passage votes or on amendments or things that are specifically related to Minnesota. And so she's been able to deflect a little bit of that, but at the end of the day, I expect to hear this as a common refrain from Kurt Bills.
There are 8 U.S. House races. Which of them do you think will be the most competitive?
Well, certainly all signs point to the 8th District. We've already seen the most ads in the 8th District. It's ranked by Roll Call. The newspaper of Capitol Hill is one of only 27 toss-up races in the country this cycle. And so just looking at the political geography, the fact that in 2008 it did go for President Obama. Of course, it had a long-serving incumbent in Jim Oberstar, who was defeated in 2010, much to everyone's surprise. And so even though Chip Kravac is the incumbent and has 2 years of legislation to talk about, that's not a very long time to build up a record to really brag about. And so he is a vulnerable incumbent, both because he's served a short time, because of the political geography, and he's made some missteps. Moving his family to New Hampshire did not exactly endear him to local voters, so it's going to be a competitive race.
Any others that you see on the House side that may be competitive?
Well, we're beginning to hear more conversation about Minnesota's 6th District. And that's in part because Congresswoman Michele Bachmann, the incumbent, is nationally known. I mean, she ran for president, she was well known before that, and she enjoys being the center of attention, often going on to cable news shows and making, at times, incendiary comments about President Obama, the Obama administration. And so I think because of that, even though it's an overwhelmingly Republican district, a district that I think went 43% is newly configured for Obama in 2008, she does open herself up to possible defections from independent voters who've supported her in the past, and even some Republicans who may be wary of having her in the news associated with some of these misstatements of fact or more incendiary comments. But it is an uphill battle for Jim Graves. It's a Republican district, and so the next couple of months will tell us if he's able to raise enough money and get his name out and really sort of show his credentials not as a Democrat, because that will not win him the election, but as someone who is a moderate businessman from St. Cloud. But I think at this point, it's an uphill battle for Graves.
Now, Graves certainly has some personal wealth that he could conceivably tap. Is that going to help him out? Because how much money do you think on the national side the Democratic Party will want to infuse into that particular race?
Certainly having your own money helps, but it's also helpful to build up small contributions from your district, because that gets more people invested. So someone who writes you a $25 check is more likely to tell their neighbor, tell their friends, and go door knocking for you, because people feel an investment. So he's got to raise money from people in the district. And then I think whether or not the national parties get involved really depends on the polls and depends what happens as the election grows closer. You know, at this point, I don't think the parties are going to target it, but they could. If Republicans feel like they need to jump in to defend Congresswoman Bachmann, although she will have no problem raising money. But Democrats might see this as a potential pickup that they weren't envisioning earlier, but I think we're a ways off from that.
2010 was a wave election, much like the 2006 election was, but in 2010 we saw more of an anti-incumbent component. That, of course, helped unseat longtime U.S. Representative James Oberstar. Mm-hmm. Do you think we're going to see that same kind of momentum informing at all the 2012 elections?
I think 2012 is shaping up to be quite a bit different. I mean, 2010 was an absolute tidal wave election in which 64 House seats changed parties, went Republican. And so that was just really quite phenomenal in terms of a seat shift in modern history. And I think what we're seeing in 2012 is a series of local races. You know, even though the issues are often national, they're really being fought on a race-by-race basis. And so it's hard to say, actually, if there even is a national tide. And I think that I would argue there's not a national tide, but a series of close races in, you know, somewhat evenly split districts where perhaps new incumbents or redrawn seats because of redistricting are changing the dynamics in 2012.
Let's talk about redistricting. What kind of impact do you foresee that having on the upcoming elections?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in Minnesota, not a huge impact. Certainly, the 6th district, for example, got a little bit more Republican, helping Congresswoman Bachmann out. The 2nd district actually did get a little bit more Democratic, although it still certainly leans Republican, suggesting that even if John Klein isn't particularly vulnerable in this cycle, if his margin goes down, that could make him more vulnerable 2 years from now. But we're going to see some massive upheavals in states like California, where there's just a record number of incumbents running against one another, whether it's a Democrat versus a Democrat in newly drawn districts or Democrats versus Republican. But on average, if you look at House races across the country, because of redistricting, Republicans are helped somewhat. Not a lot, but somewhat. But interestingly, if you look at the national generic polls, Democrats are faring slightly better in congressional races. But that's really not that helpful in terms of information because of the way that voters are distributed. So there are a lot of democratically held districts that are not very efficient for Democrats, which is to say Democrats win by, you know, wide margins, 70, 75, 80%, wasting a lot of Democratic votes. And Republican districts across the country are a little bit more efficient, so Republicans are wasting fewer votes in those Republican-held districts.
Please stay with us. When Access Minnesota returns, we'll discuss state politics with U of M political science professor Kathryn Pearson.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.